The sun had barely risen, yet the desert already burned. A line of prisoners stood barefoot on the scorching sand, their wrists bound with rough fiber rope. Dust clung to their skin. Many had marched for days, captured in a war they never expected, dragged far from their homes, their futures erased in a single defeat. An Egyptian officer stepped forward, his shadow long against the ground. He did not shout. He simply raised his hand. The signal was enough. The ropes were cut, and the prisoners were ordered to run. No explanation, no finish line in sight. Just the endless horizon trembling under waves of heat. At first, they sprinted, driven by fear more than strength. Guards followed on chariots, watching closely. Anyone who slowed felt the sting of a whip or the butt of a spear. Minutes passed. Then more. Breathing turned ragged, feet blistered against the burning earth. One man stumbled, then another. When the first prisoner collapsed, no one stopped to help him. Stopping meant joining him, because this was not a race for sport. It was a test, a filter. Only those strong enough to endure would be allowed to live and work. The weak were seen as useless, burdens in an empire that demanded relentless labor. To the Egyptians overseeing the trial, this was practical, efficient, even necessary. But to the prisoners, it was something else entirely. A cruel game where the prize was survival, and losing could mean disappearing into the desert forever. And this was only the beginning. Across ancient Egypt, power was not just enforced through chains. It was performed through trials like these, designed to break the body and command the mind. The question is not whether such tests existed. The question is how far this civilization was willing to go to prove its dominance. Most of the people forced into these brutal trials had not been born into slavery. They had been swept into it by war. Victories brought more than land and tribute. They delivered human captives by the thousands. Bound together and marched across vast distances, these prisoners entered Egypt not as future citizens, but as spoils of conquest, living proof of the pharaoh's dominance. Officials carefully recorded them, sometimes listing entire groups in temple inscriptions where they were described alongside livestock and precious metals. Once inside the empire, captives were redistributed to royal estates, massive building projects, agricultural fields, and temple complexes that required endless labor to function. Families were often separated, identities stripped away, and foreign names replaced. In the eyes of the state, they were no longer individuals with histories. They were resources to be measured, assigned, and controlled. And before they could be put to work, many would face harsh evaluations designed to determine exactly how much suffering their bodies could endure. In ancient Egypt, the concept of ma'at, or cosmic order, guided every part of life. Pharaohs were not just rulers, they were seen as divine guarantors of balance. Anything that threatened that order, rebellious subjects, invading armies, or captured foreigners, was viewed as chaos that had to be controlled. Strength and endurance were not merely admired, they were expected. Captives brought into Egypt were often forced into harsh physical trials to determine how much labor they could endure. These tests were both practical, assessing their ability to work, and symbolic, demonstrating the state's absolute authority. The trials were rarely private. Guards, overseers, and nobles often watched as prisoners were pushed to their limits. The suffering of a few became a performance, a reminder to others that disobedience or weakness was unacceptable. In this way, domination became ritualized. The empire did not just seek obedience, it sought to make power visible. Every forced task, every grueling exercise, and every public test of strength reinforced the message. The pharaoh's control extended over every body, every action, and every breath of those who had no choice but to obey. The desert was one of ancient Egypt's harshest classrooms, and captives often found themselves at the mercy of its heat and emptiness. Forced marches across miles of blistering sand were common, designed not to teach, but to test. Prisoners had to carry heavy loads, race against the sun, or perform exhausting labor while overseers watched, ready to punish the slightest falter. These endurance trials were a grim filter. Those who could keep moving were deemed fit for labor, while those who collapsed often did not survive. Survival depended on speed, strength, and sheer willpower, and even then there were no guarantees. Many prisoners were deliberately pushed beyond natural limits, turning simple tasks into life-or-death competitions. Beyond testing the body, these trials also served as psychological warfare. Captives witnessed others fall, knowing they might be next. Fear, exhaustion, and humiliation were tools used to ensure submission. The desert itself became a weapon, a vast arena where the empire could demonstrate that resistance was futile and endurance was mandatory. In this way, work and punishment merged into a cruel game, one where every step measured not just strength, but one's very right to live under Egyptian rule. Endurance and labor were only part of the ordeal. In many cases, captives were subjected to ritualized humiliation, a form of control that attacked both body and spirit. They were often paraded through temple courtyards, their hands and feet bound, while priests and nobles observed. These ceremonies were meant to display the absolute power of the pharaoh and the state over foreign captives. Sometimes prisoners were forced to kneel or bow before statues of gods or the pharaoh himself, performing acts of submission that erased their identity and reinforced their inferiority. Their every movement was scrutinized, turning obedience into performance. Failure to comply could result in severe punishment, including beatings or execution. The humiliation was deliberate. It sent a clear message. Defiance was not tolerated, and captivity meant total subjugation. These ceremonies blurred the line between punishment and spectacle, transforming suffering into a tool of political theater. In a society obsessed with order and dominance, such displays were not simply acts of cruelty. They were a method of enforcing psychological control, ensuring that captives understood their place and that the state's authority went unquestioned. Physical punishment was a common and highly visible part of life for captives in ancient Egypt. Beatings were not always private corrections. They were often carried out in front of other prisoners, overseers, and sometimes even visiting officials. The goal was clear: to instill fear and maintain strict discipline. Whips, rods, and other implements were used to enforce obedience, and even minor mistakes could lead to severe pain. Guards did not hesitate to strike captives who slowed during labor, faltered in a ritual, or showed signs of resistance. Each blow was both a punishment and a public lesson. These punishments also had a symbolic purpose. They reminded captives, and anyone watching, that their bodies were under the control of the state. Pain became a tool of authority, demonstrating that submission was expected not just in thought, but in every movement and gesture. In essence, the beatings were part of a broader spectacle of power. They reinforced the social hierarchy, confirmed the pharaoh's dominance, and blurred the line between labor, ritual, and cruelty, leaving captives trapped in a world where suffering was both inevitable and performative. For many captives, the harshest trials were not in the open desert, but deep within Egypt's quarries and mines. Places like the Sinai Peninsula were notorious for their deadly working conditions. Prisoners were sent to extract stone, copper, and precious minerals, tasks that demanded immense strength, skill, and endurance. The work itself was grueling, but the environment made it even more lethal. Blistering heat, scarce water, and treacherous terrain turned every task into a fight for survival. Collapsing under exhaustion could mean death, either from injury, dehydration, or the overseer's punishment. In many cases, the mines functioned almost like execution grounds, weeding out those deemed too weak to serve the state. These assignments were framed as labor, but in reality, they were also tests. Survival games designed to measure a prisoner's resilience. Those who endured were considered fit for continued work. Those who failed were often discarded, their bodies left as warnings for others. In this way, quarries and mines became arenas of endurance and terror. Captives were forced to prove their strength under conditions so extreme that simply surviving was an extraordinary feat. Here, work and cruelty merged, turning the extraction of stone and metal into a brutal form of performance. Some captives were forced into trials that went beyond labor, thrusting them into staged hunts or combat exercises. These were not games for fun. They were exercises in both skill and survival, often designed to benefit Egyptian soldiers, while endangering the prisoners. In certain cases, war captives acted as live targets for archery practice or as opponents in simulated battles. Guards and soldiers used these exercises to train for real conflicts, testing weapons, tactics, and coordination under conditions that were terrifyingly real for those being forced to fight. Failure could mean death, while survival often depended on quick thinking, agility, and sheer luck. These exercises served multiple purposes. They honed the military skills of Egyptian forces, reinforced the subjugation of captives, and sent a clear warning to others. Resistance would be met with immediate and visible consequences. For the prisoners, every movement was measured, every choice potentially fatal. The mock hunts and combat drills blurred the line between play and punishment, turning human endurance into a spectacle of fear, skill, and domination. In the eyes of the Egyptians, these trials were practical. For the captives, they were cruel games with life itself as the stake. In temples and tombs across Egypt, carvings and reliefs depict pharaohs smiting their enemies, often in exaggerated, dramatic poses. These images were not mere decoration. They were carefully crafted messages about power, control, and the consequences of defiance. Captured prisoners were frequently shown bound, kneeling, or being struck down, reinforcing the idea that resistance was futile. These symbolic victories mirrored the real-life trials captives endured: forced labor, ritual humiliation, and deadly games. By turning their suffering into public art, the state reinforced the pharaoh's authority not only over those present, but across the empire. The message was clear. The pharaoh had the divine right to dominate, and the conquered had no place but under his control. Even for those who never saw these depictions, the imagery shaped perception and behavior. In this way, art and ritual worked together. Physical suffering, forced obedience, and visual propaganda merged to create a society where domination was constant, visible, and unquestionable. The captive's ordeal extended beyond the fields and deserts. It became eternalized in stone, a permanent testament to the empire's power. While the images and accounts of cruelty are striking, it's important to understand the full context. Ancient Egypt was a complex civilization, and not every captive faced the same fate. Some laborers, particularly those with specialized skills, were given tasks that allowed them to survive and occasionally even thrive within the system. Temple artisans, scribes, and craftsmen could earn favor or relative security, demonstrating that life under Egyptian rule was not uniformly brutal. At the same time, the scale of suffering should not be minimized. Mortality in mines, quarries, and on forced marches was high, and many captives endured extreme punishment as part of displays of power. Archaeological evidence and historical inscriptions confirm that physical trials, humiliation ceremonies, and endurance games were real, even if some narratives have been lost or exaggerated over time. By separating myth from reality, we gain a clearer picture. Ancient Egypt was a civilization capable of incredible achievement and innovation, but it also maintained control through fear, coercion, and the carefully orchestrated suffering of those it considered expendable. Understanding this duality helps us appreciate the human cost behind the empire's grandeur, a cost often invisible in the monuments that still awe us today. The word games might seem strange when describing the ordeals faced by captives in ancient Egypt, but it captures the disturbing combination of ritual, competition, and spectacle. These were structured challenges, often public, designed to test strength, endurance, and obedience. But unlike modern games, the stakes were life or death. Whether it was forced races across the desert, grueling labor in quarries, or mock hunts for training soldiers, captives were compelled to perform under strict rules while being watched by guards, officials, or even nobles. Every failure was punished, every success barely guaranteed survival. In essence, the empire turned suffering into a performance, a game, where the only prize was the chance to live another day. Calling these trials games also highlights the psychological dimension. Captives were forced to compete, not for glory, but to demonstrate usefulness and submission. Fear, exhaustion, and humiliation became tools of control, and the audience, the Egyptian elite, derived satisfaction and reinforced social hierarchy from observing. By framing these ordeals as games, we see how ancient Egypt blurred the line between labor, punishment, and entertainment, a cruel intersection of survival, spectacle, and authority. Beyond the physical trials and public punishments, ancient Egypt relied on the psychological impact of these practices to maintain control. Captives learned quickly that every action was monitored and every mistake could bring pain or death. Fear became a constant companion, shaping behavior and ensuring obedience even without constant supervision. Witnessing the suffering of others was just as powerful as experiencing it firsthand. When one prisoner collapsed during a forced march, or was humiliated in front of a temple courtyard, the message rippled through the rest. Defiance would not be tolerated. The empire weaponized observation itself, turning the act of watching into a tool of control. This psychological machinery extended beyond captives. Local populations, slaves with relative freedom, and even visitors to the temples saw the displays of dominance and were reminded of the pharaoh's unassailable authority. In a society obsessed with order and cosmic balance, submission was not optional. It was necessary to maintain both personal safety and social stability. By combining labor, endurance trials, public humiliation, and psychological intimidation, ancient Egypt created a system where control was absolute. Captives survived not just through strength, but by internalizing fear. A reminder that in this civilization, domination was as much about the mind as it was about the body. The monuments of ancient Egypt, pyramids, temples, and tombs, have long captivated the world with their beauty and grandeur. Yet hidden within the carved walls and painted reliefs are echoes of the human suffering that helped build them. Bound captives, defeated enemies, and laborers toiling under the desert sun appear repeatedly in art, often alongside images of victorious pharaohs. These carvings were more than decoration. They were statements of power. Every figure depicted in chains or bowing before a ruler reinforced the idea that the empire's strength rested not only on wealth and military might, but also on the subjugation of others. In this sense, stone and paint became a form of historical record, immortalizing both triumph and cruelty. Even today, when we marvel at the precision of a temple wall or the scale of a pyramid, we are looking at a civilization that enforced its dominance through the careful orchestration of labor and punishment. Behind every polished surface, there were stories of endurance, fear, and sacrifice that rarely survived in written texts. The echoes of these lives remind us that ancient Egypt's legacy was built not just with stone and gold, but with the bodies and resilience of those who had no choice but to serve. It's easy to look at these accounts and assume that ancient Egypt was uniquely harsh, but in reality, many civilizations throughout history used forced labor, ritualized punishment, and displays of power to control populations. From Mesopotamia to Assyria, rulers often demanded obedience through fear, and enslaved or captured peoples were subjected to similar trials. What sets Egypt apart, however, is the combination of spectacle, ritual, and ideology. Laborers and captives were not only punished physically, their suffering was woven into religious and political narratives. By linking cruelty to cosmic order and divine authority, the Egyptians elevated punishment into performance, turning domination into both a practical and symbolic tool. At the same time, not every Egyptian ruler or project was brutal. Skilled workers and favored captives could find relative security, and some were even able to improve their social standing. This complexity shows that while cruelty was real and widespread, it coexisted with pragmatism, social mobility, and moments of leniency. In short, ancient Egypt was neither uniquely evil nor purely benevolent. Its greatness was inseparable from its capacity for control, a control that often manifested in the most harsh and public ways imaginable. Most of the captives forced into these cruel games left no written records. Their stories were rarely recorded by the Egyptians themselves, and the vast majority of personal experiences were lost to history. What remains are fragments, inscriptions on temple walls, reliefs showing bound prisoners, and accounts written from the perspective of the victors. Because of this, the true human cost of Egypt's grandeur is almost impossible to fully measure. We see the pyramids, the temples, and the statues, but the labor, fear, and suffering behind them are largely invisible. The voices of those who endured extreme punishment, relentless labor, or ritualized humiliation were intentionally silenced, their lives reduced to mere tools of empire. Yet even in these fragments, we catch glimpses of resilience. Some captives survived impossible conditions, adapted, and in rare cases, integrated into Egyptian society. Their endurance is a testament to the human spirit, even in the shadow of oppression. By remembering these forgotten voices, we gain a deeper understanding of ancient Egypt, not just as a civilization of wonder, but as a society where power, survival, and cruelty were inseparably intertwined. As we step back from the monuments, temples, and golden tombs, it becomes clear that ancient Egypt's grandeur came with a hidden cost. Behind the polished stone and divine imagery were countless lives subjected to labor, fear, and cruel games designed to enforce obedience. Captives were pushed to their limits, their suffering made visible as a tool of control, yet largely erased from the historical record. The civilization we admire for its innovation and beauty was also a society where power demanded spectacle, and dominance was performed through endurance, humiliation, and pain. The pyramids and temples remain, timeless and awe-inspiring, but the stories of those who built them, endured them, or were forced to participate in the pharaohs' rituals of control are almost entirely forgotten. It forces us to ask a difficult question: can a civilization be both magnificent and merciless? The answer, at least in Egypt's case, is painfully clear. The glory and the shadow existed side by side, and the human cost of that balance is a story that deserves to be remembered. Even thousands of years later, these echoes remind us that history is never only about triumph. It is also about endurance, survival, and the silent lives that shape the world we see today.